Okay, and we're gonna head right into the next speaker. So the next speaker is Dr. Michael Moore. He has an MSc from the University of California and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Moore is the former chief economist at the U.S. National Renewable Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, where he led a research team engaged in examining over-the-horizon issues for the U.S. Department of Energy and developed new methods of cross-cutting analysis. He is an economist and a former commissioner with the California Energy Commission, where he held the designated economist position. Dr. Moore is an active researcher in the areas of urban open space and agriculture, land conservation, local government fiscal impact, and the structure and rules of energy markets. He is an accomplished public speaker and participates in a wide variety of public forums ranging from energy and fiscal policy to land use. Can everybody please join me in welcoming Dr. Moore? Oh, okay. And you didn't?
No. Camera okay for this angle?
Yeah, just don't
Okay. Thank you. Nice to be here, and nice to see all of the students in the competition. I appreciate very much. I have my own private teams that I'm voting for, of course, but since I won't be a judge, you don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to influence the outcomes. Time's a little constrained this morning, so I'm going to focus on a short synopsis of sustainability from the point of view of an economist, from the point of view of how we value what I'll call natural capital. And in order to get there, in order to address this question of a global understanding, in order to address the question of a global understanding of sustainability, I want to redefine it slightly and point you to the idea that global understanding and energy systems themselves are really an evolutionary process. They're not a solution. They don't have an endpoint. In fact, the search, the quest for sustainable energy, usable energy is just endless. And so that means that the process itself has got to be as efficient or as equitable in distribution as possible. We focus on sustainable development, and Dr. Page talked about that in his remarks. That implies growth, of course, and for most of us, that means growth at the margin. So if we're thinking about what happens, we think about a community, we're imagining growth at the edges. For those of you who do planning work, you know that the old von Thunen model from the 1800s is all about growing in concentric rings around communities, and as a matter of fact, most decision makers who think of that tend to focus first at the margin, at the edges. But in fact, for us, at this pretty unique moment in time, we might imagine this as a transition of forms, melding, as we think about the world economy, a melding of an unequal, a maldistributed, and patently unfair world economy. It's not fair at all. It certainly doesn't have equal distribution. It certainly doesn't have equal levels of consumption. And that means that this transition to something that's always happening at the edges has got to be redefined. And the transition in that definition means and deconstruction of old forms. Many of you know that the developed world has been fussing around over the last 20 years with the idea of deregulating economic systems, especially energy systems, with the idea that we would gain more efficiency. In most cases, that devolution of regulation has been driven by a quest for higher and higher profit structures on the part of industry. So almost little to do in any case with more efficiency of consumer consumption or more efficiency of the markets themselves, but simply lower prices for industry. And it's led us to a couple of steep cliffs that we went off, unfortunately, and have not really come back from yet. So we're put in a position where we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to throw out? What do we want to keep? What do we want to have for value in the coming years? Several of my colleagues here and at Cornell have abandoned their print libraries. They now base their research in the cloud. and they exchange their receipts and records in the cloud or in some electronic medium. We keep electronic receipts, we keep records of our purchases, notes, health records, family photos in many cases. The cloud is, as they used to say in Silicon Valley, the next new thing. So good for us, good for you. We grow at the margin, we tend to innovate, to compete, and to make progress, and it was always so. But I ask you, what happens when the power goes out? What do we do with the cloud when we can't sustain it? What does Visa do with your credit card records when they have a power outage? Well, they try to back things up, of course, and we try to back up the cloud, we try to back up our energy systems, but in each case, underneath that cloud, these lights, the electric light rail, the diesel buses, the automobiles we use for basic transportation, tractors on the farm, trucks that make agriculture productive, sea transport. We're fussing around right now with a couple of large pipeline proposals to move bitumen or unconventional oil through Canadian hinterlands. Is all about getting it to the water so that it can move to other markets more efficiently. So tidewater access is a key item. And that means that sea transport takes on a new dimension, a new importance, to move grain, fuel, cloth, toys, computers, wood products back and forth, or fishing trawlers that harvest fish. Ever present in all of that is a demand for energy. It's just in different forms. Combustible hydrocarbons, nuclear fission, wind, solar capture, geothermal heat transfer, tidal flux, biomass conversion, rivers. Our cupboard's pretty well stocked, diverse, widely distributed, but it's not there for the picking, is it? It has to be transformed, it has to be moved back and forth, and it has to be somehow consumed by sophisticated devices at the end. In every single instance, it's not free, and by not free, I mean that it's not costless, and it's also not endless. So I'm back to the term sustainability, which is what brings you here today, and I want to diverge for just a second and say we owe a great deal of debt to the Brundtland Commission from some years back, who took a lot of time to define the word sustainability, and let me repeat it for you, what Gert Brundtland said. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, we're left with two pretty broad and yawning abysses in that. What's a need? And implied in that, what's a limitation? What's the range or what's the scope that is implied by this concept of sustainability? And as I tell my economics classes, in that case, it's all about time. Whether we discount the future greatly or not, it's all about the time scale that we imagine. And for most of us, the idea of sustainability is not 5, 6, 7 generations out. In fact, when you're in your 20s, most of the time your idea of sustainability is consumption over the next decade or so. Nothing wrong with that, but it's pretty hard to imagine a future that you're protecting for generations that haven't even been conceived of yet or designed, if we take some of our medical staff seriously. So let's think about needs. What are those? They're caloric at the core. We get warmth, we get shelter, we get light, and we can do work. And what are those limitations in the sustainable enterprise? Waste products. We don't pay very much attention to the waste stream. We tend to ignore it, and that takes us to some of the questions that you'll be dealing with today. What happens when we extensify our waste streams out into other countries? And for the energy world, the impacts on renewable systems, the ones that we're going to depend on for our future, and some of those include wildlife. Doesn't sound like it's connected. Think boa constrictors in the Everglades. Think about what's happening there, where 90% of the mammal life in the Everglades has been consumed by a snake that got put out there by people who were tired of having to strangle their children or take over the living room or something else. not a big deal, right? Just the lower part of the mammal community. But it turns out that, in fact, they're so connected to the water systems and to the sustainable biomass in the Everglades, which in turn is the filtration system for a good deal of the groundwater in the southern U.S., that, as a matter of fact, a lot of those systems are being upset. Today in Texas, there is a drought that has manifested itself in a way that requires trucking water in for small communities. Not likely to be overcome anytime soon. Air quality is, as many of you know, linked very, very closely to health issues. And health represents a huge sink of capital to try and repair bad conditions. That's lung diseases, asthma, stunted growth, inequality in education, and so on. Water systems, as I've just mentioned, land for runoff. We're going to be in a bad state here in Alberta when the bark beetle gets done taking over the forest just west of here, and all the river systems start to silt up after the fire. That will burn down that and release all that carbon and a lot of waste into the river and estuary systems. So the opportunity to attain sustainability based on a demand for energy is basically endless, and that's if we do it right. We have an endless opportunity to do it right, and it's tragic if we do it wrong. So pretty important to understand the system, and Dr. Page talked to you about systems engineering and how it works. What I want to do is dial back on the systems engineering part and focus just on energy systems themselves, and remind you that the system we deal with, the core system, is large and only has two engines: sun and radioactive heat from the core of the Earth. Everything else is derived, either wind, hydro, the other slow-moving systems on Earth, the hydrocarbon accumulation from biomass, but they only have two sources. So the energy that's available is pretty abundant. It's widespread, but it's expensive to acquire and transform. In other words, it's all very capital intensive. It's very long-lived, and that means we have to invest, maintain, replace, and use it efficiently. And that means integrating new technology, new techniques, and avoiding, to the extent that we can, some technology lock-in, while at the same time extending our base to those who need it most, who don't have access to capital, who don't have access to the broader systems, the energy systems that we're going to use. So in all of this, I will say that we have some goals that we need to remind ourselves of, and then move toward the future of sustainable energy with some resolve and a plan. Our goals are that we broadly want to be able to utilize, conserve, and sustain our natural capital base. That's pretty important, because if you use up your capital stock, if you have a savings account somewhere and you are spending at a rate that is in excess of the interest that's drawn off that capital account, then either you have a new capital account coming, some relative that's just about to pass on and hand over a huge inheritance. I unfortunately don't have any of those. Or you're investing somehow in order to increase that capital stock somewhere else. If you can't meet those conditions, then your capital stock is going to run out. When is a question of timing again, but in fact, the ultimate endpoint is that it will run out. So that means you want to be able to maximize local growth potential for yourself. You're the local entity, you're the end user, and most of you have very little connection to wider and wider spheres where your altruistic attitudes might make a difference. So you've got to focus first on making a difference in a local sense. And I'm going to argue that in a local focus for sustainable events. We want to minimize waste streams. We want to move to more dynamic models of energy transfer